I am Richard. I am 72 years old, and somehow I am still standing after the people I loved most tried to destroy me. I was a successful real estate CEO who thought he had built a safe fortress for his family. But the truth is, I was sleeping next to the enemy. It all unraveled on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I stopped by my wife Diane private wellness clinic to surprise her for lunch. While waiting at her perfectly organized glass desk, I noticed a silver fountain pen. When I picked it up and twisted the cap, the heavy mahogany bookshelf behind me did not just creak. It sighed almost like a living thing before silently gliding along a hidden track built into the pristine hardwood floor. I stood there frozen. My heart was suddenly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The polished silver pen slipped from my trembling fingers and hit the expensive Persian rug with a muffled thud. Engraved on the barrel of that pen were 3 simple letters. M-I-A. Mia, my daughter, my beautiful, bright daughter, who vanished without a single trace exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. I stepped forward into the cold air pouring out from the hidden space, my breath caught in my throat. The room behind the wall was not a storage closet. It was a fully equipped medical suite bathed in harsh fluorescent light. And sitting in the center of that sterile white room strapped into a heavy motorized wheelchair was my little girl. She looked so incredibly fragile. Her collarbones protruded painfully through a thin gray hospital gown. A thick, clear tube snaked from an IV bag on a metal pole directly into a bruised vein on the back of her pale hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fall to my knees and thank God that she was still alive. The police had completely stopped looking for her 18 months ago. The expensive private investigators I hired had quietly taken my millions and offered me nothing but sympathetic nods and empty promises. I had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling grieving a child I assumed was dead at the bottom of the Chicago River. Yet here she was, hidden away in a secret room. But as my eyes met hers, the initial wave of overwhelming relief instantly evaporated into absolute bone-chilling terror. Mia did not look happy to see me. She did not cry out for her father. Her hollow, dark eyes were blown wide with panic. She frantically shook her head, her gaze darting frantically, not at me, but toward the main door of the office behind me. She was utterly terrified. Let me pull you back for just a moment so you can fully understand the pure insanity of this situation. I was standing inside the executive office of the most exclusive private wellness clinic in downtown Chicago. The clinic was owned and operated by my wife, Diane. Diane was my second wife, a brilliant, charming psychologist who specialized in trauma and rehabilitation for the ultra-wealthy. When Mia disappeared, Diane was my absolute rock. She held my hand through the endless panic attacks. She managed my medication when my heart condition flared up from the overwhelming stress. She was the one who convinced me to keep living when I wanted to give up entirely. I had come to the clinic today just to surprise Diane for lunch. Her receptionist told me she was in a brief meeting and to wait in her private office. I had absent-mindedly picked up the silver pen sitting next to her notepad. I recognized it immediately. I had given that pen to Mia when she graduated from college. My thumb brushed over the familiar engraving. I twisted the cap, just a nervous habit of mine. And that was the trigger. The secret mechanism engaged, and the wall opened up like the gates of hell. Now I was looking at my missing daughter. I rushed into the hidden room, ignoring the sharp shooting pain in my chest. I dropped to my knees beside her wheelchair. I reached out to touch her face, but she flinched away from my hand violently. Her lips were dry and cracked. She tried to speak, but only a raspy, broken wheeze escaped her throat. "Mia," I whispered, my voice cracking with unshed tears. "Oh my God, Mia, what happened to you? Who did this to you? Let me get you out of here right now. I am going to call the police." I reached into my suit jacket for my cell phone. The moment my hand touched my pocket, Mia let out a muffled whimper of absolute despair. She raised her free hand, the one not tethered to the IV drip, and grabbed my wrist with a weak but desperate grip. Her eyes pleaded with me. She kept shaking her head side to side. Do not make a sound, she seemed to be begging me. Do not let them know you are here. I stared at the IV bag dripping clear liquid into her bloodstream. I looked at the heavy leather straps loosely dangling from the armrests of her wheelchair. This was not a hospital room meant for healing. This was a prison cell designed to keep a human being sedated and entirely compliant. The smell of strong clinical antiseptics made my stomach churn violently. My mind raced trying to connect the impossible dots. How could Mia be here? How could she be inside Diane Clinic of all places? Did someone rent this space without Diane knowing? Was Diane being blackmailed by a cartel? My brain simply refused to accept the most obvious and horrifying conclusion. My brain refused to believe that the woman I loved and trusted was a monster. I stood up slowly, my joints aching, my heart beating a dangerous, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I have a very bad heart. The doctors warned me years ago that sudden severe stress could be completely fatal. I forced myself to breathe evenly. I need to get you out of this chair, I told Mia softly, trying to project a calm strength I absolutely did not feel. I reached for the IV needle taped to her bruised hand. I planned to rip it out, grab her, and run out into the lobby, screaming for help. Before my fingers could even touch the medical tape, the sound of the main office door opening echoed loudly through the quiet room. The heavy brass handle turned with a sharp click. The door swung open, and the familiar click of designer heels tapped against the hardwood floor. "Richard, honey, are you in here?" It was Diane. Her voice was smooth and melodic, perfectly calm, perfectly normal. The voice of a loving, devoted wife. The voice of a woman who had just kept my daughter locked behind a wall for 2 agonizing years. I froze in place. The blood drained completely from my face, leaving me cold and numb. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, and a single tear rolled down her hollow cheek. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. The trap was sprung, and the devil was walking right into the room. Diane stepped through the hidden doorway. The harsh fluorescent light caught the pristine white of her tailored blazer. I expected her to drop the ceramic coffee mug she was holding. I expected her to scream or stumble backward in horror at being caught red-handed. Instead, she merely paused. A brief flicker of annoyance crossed her perfectly manicured features, just like when the dry cleaner ruins a silk blouse. Then she sighed softly. It was a long, deeply patronizing sigh. She closed the heavy mahogany door behind her with a soft click, sealing the 3 of us inside this sterile vault. "What is this?" My voice came out as a harsh, guttural whisper. I pointed a shaking finger at the wheelchair. "What have you done to my daughter, Diane? Why is she here? Why is she tied up like an animal?" Diane did not immediately answer. She walked over to the metal tray beside the IV stand, moving with the casual grace that had made me fall in love with her a decade ago. She adjusted a small plastic valve on the IV tubing. Mia flinched so violently her chair rattled, but Diane just patted her bruised hand with chilling affection. "I was going to tell you, Richard." Diane said, her tone as soothing as a therapist speaking to an irrational patient. "I was just waiting for the right moment. You know I have always tried to protect you from things that could hurt you." "Protect me." I choked on the words. "You locked my daughter in a secret room for 2 years. We had funerals for her. I wept in your arms every single night. And I held you." Diane countered smoothly, turning to face me. Her eyes were pools of dark, calm water. "I held you together, Richard. When your heart gave out last winter, who was the one who slept in the hospital chair next to you? Who made sure your blood pressure stayed down? Who managed the company board when you were too weak to stand?" I did. I have spent the last 10 years dedicating every ounce of my being to keeping you alive. If I had told you the truth about Mia, it would have killed you on the spot. I made a medical and psychological decision to bear this burden for you. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical blow to my chest. A sharp, familiar pain flared behind my sternum, and I instinctively gripped the fabric of my shirt. I had a triple bypass surgery 5 years ago. My heart was a fragile, battered engine, and Diane knew exactly how to manipulate it. She was looking at my clutching hand right now, her eyes calculating the exact rhythm of my failing pulse. "Do not try to spin this." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand taller despite the crushing weight in my chest. "You are a monster. I am taking her out of here. I am taking my daughter home, and then I am calling the police." I took a step toward the wheelchair. Before I could reach the metal handles, Diane stepped effortlessly into my path. Up close, I could smell her expensive vanilla perfume. It was the scent I woke up to every morning, the scent of my supposed savior. Now it smelled like poison. "Richard, please do not make a scene," Diane whispered, raising a hand to gently touch my cheek. I jerked my face away from her cold fingers. "Look at yourself. Your face is flushed. Your breathing is shallow. You are going to trigger another atrial fibrillation. If you collapse in here, I cannot guarantee I will be able to revive you. And then what will happen to poor little Mia?" She gestured toward the wheelchair. Mia had shrunk in on herself completely. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her chest heaving with silent, panicked breaths. She looked nothing like the fierce, independent woman who used to argue with me over corporate ethics at the dinner table. Diane had broken her, systematically and completely. "Get out of my way," I growled, stepping forward again. Diane did not move. Her calm facade cracked just a fraction, revealing the ruthless predator underneath. "If you walk out that door with her, Richard, you will destroy everything. She is not well. She is sick. She needs specialized care that only I can provide. If you take her to a hospital, they will ask questions. They will dig into things. Do you really want her name dragged through the mud again? Do you want the press to see what she has become?" I stared at the woman I had called my wife. The woman who had picked out my ties, cooked my low-sodium meals, and kissed me goodnight. I realized in that suffocating room that I did not know her at all. Every act of kindness over the past decade had been a calculated investment. She was cultivating my absolute dependence on her. She made herself the gatekeeper to my health, my daily routine, and eventually my entire life. "What did you do to her?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow. "Why would you do this? We have more money than we could ever spend. If she was sick, we could have gotten her the best doctors in the world. Why hide her like a shameful secret?" "Because she was a danger to herself and to our family," Diane replied flatly. She folded her arms across her chest. "You always wore blinders when it came to your precious daughter, Richard. You refused to see her flaws. You gave her that massive trust fund. You handed her the keys to the kingdom. She was throwing it all away. I stepped in to manage a crisis you were too weak to handle." I looked over Diane's shoulder at Mia. My daughter slowly raised her head. Her lips parted. She did not make a sound, but she mouthed a single word to me. The word was run. She wanted me to leave her. She knew my heart was failing. She knew Diane held all the cards in this sterile, isolated room. If I pushed too hard right now, Diane could simply lock us both in here. No one knew I was down here. The clinic staff thought I was waiting in the outer office. If I dropped dead from a heart attack, Diane would easily spin it as a tragic medical event. She was a doctor. She knew exactly how to make a murder look like natural causes. My mind raced, operating on decades of cutthroat business instincts. In boardrooms, when you realize you are walking into an ambush, you do not fight a losing battle. You retreat. You gather your resources. You blindside your enemy when they think they have won. I had to play her game. I had to make her believe her manipulation was still working. The sharp pain in my chest throbbed, serving as a grim reminder of my physical limitations. I let out a long, ragged breath and intentionally slumped my shoulders. I let the fight drain out of my posture. I brought my trembling hand up to my forehead, rubbing my temples as if I was completely overwhelmed by the situation. "I do not understand," I mumbled, letting my voice waver and crack. "I just do not understand, Diane. I thought she was dead. I thought she drowned in the river." Diane's expression instantly softened. The predator vanished, and the loving caretaker reappeared with terrifying speed. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my torso, pressing her head against my chest. "I know, darling," she murmured, stroking my back. "I know it is a terrible shock, but this is a miracle. We have her back. She is safe here with me. I am fixing her. We are going to be a family again. Just let me handle this. You need to rest. Your heart cannot take this kind of stress." I stood perfectly still, accepting the embrace of a monster. Over her shoulder, I met Mia's terrified eyes. I offered my daughter the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. I was making her a silent promise. "I am not abandoning you. I am going to tear this woman's world apart." "Okay," I whispered hoarsely, resting my chin on Diane's shoulder. "Okay, Diane, you are right. My chest hurts. I feel very dizzy. I need to sit down in the other room." "Of course you do," Diane cooed, stepping back and taking my arm gently. "Let us go back to my office. I will get you some water and your medication. Mia needs to rest anyway." Diane turned back to the wheelchair. She smiled warmly at my captive daughter. "Be a good girl, Mia. Your father and I will be right outside." Mia squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body trembling. I turned away, letting Diane lead me out of the hidden room. I listened to the heavy mahogany bookshelf slide back into place behind us, sealing my flesh and blood inside the walls. I smiled weakly at my wife, masking the burning inferno of hatred that had just ignited in my soul. Diane guided me to the plush leather sofa in her main office. The transition from the sterile nightmare of the hidden room to this warm, inviting space was deeply disorienting. Sunlight streamed through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in a deceptively cheerful glow. She walked over to the mahogany side table and poured a glass of ice water from a crystal pitcher. Her movements were smooth, unhurried, and entirely ordinary. She handed me the glass along with a small white pill she pulled from her blazer pocket. "It is your blood pressure medication," she said softly. "Take it, Richard. Your pulse is still far too high." I took the pill and the glass. I did not swallow the pill. Instead, I raised the water to my lips and subtly slipped the tablet under my tongue. I could not trust a single thing this woman gave me anymore. I leaned back against the leather cushions and let out a shaky breath. "Now tell me the truth," I demanded, my voice deliberately weak. "Tell me exactly what is going on here." Diane sat in the armchair opposite me, crossing her legs with a poise that made my stomach churn. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow. "You have to understand, Richard," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years ago, Mia was not just going through a phase. She was in terrible danger. She was using heavy narcotics, heroin mostly. But that was not even the worst part. She had gotten herself involved with some very dangerous people, a local syndicate connected to the cartel. She owed them a staggering amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I stared at her, letting my mouth fall open in feigned shock. Diane continued, her eyes welling with perfectly timed tears. "They were threatening her life, Richard. They were threatening our family. They knew who you were. They knew about your wealth." Mia came to me, terrified out of her mind. "She begged me not to tell you. She knew your heart was failing, and she was absolutely convinced the stress of a cartel threat would kill you. So I took the burden upon myself. I paid off a portion of her debt using my own private funds. But they kept coming back for more. They wanted her blood." As Diane spun her flawless web of lies, my mind involuntarily drifted back to those dark months before Mia vanished. The terrifying part was how perfectly Diane's story aligned with reality. 2 years ago, Mia had been spiraling. After her mother died, she had always struggled with depression, but it had gotten remarkably worse. She dropped out of her graduate program in architecture. She stopped showing up for Sunday dinners. When I did see her, she looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, her weight dropping drastically. She had started hanging around a crowd I did not recognize, people who refused to look me in the eye when they picked her up from our estate. I remembered the late-night phone calls where she would ask for large sums of money, claiming it was for a business venture she could not talk about yet. I remembered the arguments we had in the foyer, her screaming that I controlled her life with my money, and me yelling back that she was throwing her potential away. Diane had always been the mediator. Diane was always the one who would go upstairs, knock on Mia's locked bedroom door, and spend hours talking her down. Diane had positioned herself as the trusted confidant, while I was the overbearing father. The lie was terrifyingly plausible because it was built on a foundation of undeniable truth. If anyone else had told me this story, I would have believed it instantly. The syndicate gave her an ultimatum, Diane said, brushing a tear from her cheek. They were going to make an example out of her. I had no choice, Richard. I had to make her disappear. I hired private security to stage the scene at the bridge to make it look like she had jumped. I brought her here in the middle of the night. This clinic is completely secure. The room behind my office is soundproof and off the grid. It was the only way to keep her completely hidden from the people who wanted her dead. And the wheelchair, I asked, letting my voice crack with manufactured emotion. The IV bag. Why is she tied down? Diane sighed heavily, looking down at her hands. She is going through an aggressive long-term detox protocol. Her brain chemistry is completely shattered from the drugs. When she is awake, she is violent. She tries to hurt herself. She tries to break out. The restraints and the sedatives are for her own protection until her mind heals. I am treating her, Richard. I am saving her life. I looked into the eyes of the woman who had masterminded the destruction of my family. She looked like a saint bearing an unbearable cross. I slowly leaned forward and buried my face in my hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob. I forced my shoulders to shake. "Oh, Diane!" I cried out, my voice muffled by my palms. My poor little girl. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea it was this bad. I felt her warm hand gently stroke the back of my neck. "I know, darling," she whispered. "I know. I did what I had to do to protect our family. And I will keep protecting you both, no matter what it takes. Just trust me completely." I continued to weep quietly into my hands, playing the fragile role of the broken old man perfectly. She truly thought she had won. She thought her brilliant web of deceit was totally impenetrable. But she did not realize that the terrified prey was actually a patient hunter. "It is going to be all right, Richard," she whispered. "I have everything under control." I needed to pull myself together and act like the weak, dependent husband she believed me to be. I slowly lowered my hands, grabbing a tissue from the polished wooden dispenser on her desk. I dabbed at my eyes, making sure they looked red and pathetic. As I leaned forward, catching my breath, my gaze swept across the pristine surface of her glass desk. Diane was a meticulous woman. She never left things out of place. But in her haste to intercept me, she had left a thin manila folder slightly open near her keyboard. The bold black letters at the top of the thick legal document caught my eye instantly. Power of attorney. My heart skipped a painful beat. My eyes scanned the visible text upside down. I saw Mia's full legal name. I saw the name of the family trust fund. A cartel assassin does not ask for a power of attorney. A drug syndicate does not need legal authorization to manage a financial portfolio. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Diane was not hiding Mia from a cartel. Diane was holding her hostage to steal the massive trust fund I had set up for my daughter. The sheer scale of her greed was staggering. She was starving and sedating my daughter just a few feet away from where she sat, nodding sympathetically at my manufactured tears. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I forced a trembling smile, looking up at Diane with wide, grateful eyes. "You are an angel, Diane," I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. "I do not know what I would do without you, but please, I need to see her one more time before we go home. Just for a minute. I need to look at my little girl again." Diane hesitated. I saw the gears turning in her calculating mind. She weighed the risk of letting me back into that room against the risk of denying a grieving father his emotional closure. She chose the path of the benevolent savior. "Of course, darling," she said softly, "but only for a moment. Her heart rate was quite elevated, and she needs to sleep the medication off." She walked over to the bookshelf, pressing the hidden switch disguised behind a row of heavy encyclopedias. The wall glided open once again. The blast of cold, sterile air sound hit my face, grounding me in the terrifying reality of the moment. We stepped back into the nightmare. Mia had not moved. She was still slumped down in the heavy motorized wheelchair, the IV fluid dripping methodically into her bruised vein. As we walked into the room, Mia's fragile head snapped up. Her hollow eyes darted past me and locked directly onto Diane. I watched my daughter's reaction closely. I had seen addicts in withdrawal. I had seen people in deep physical pain. But the true look on Mia's face was not the agony of a drug detox. It was pure, unadulterated terror. Her breathing hitched, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow spasms. She shrank back against the leather seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was looking at Diane the way a cornered animal looks at a butcher. Diane stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Your father is going to head home now, sweetie," Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "He is very tired and you need to rest too. Say goodbye to Daddy." Mia did not speak. She just kept trembling, her eyes wide and fixed on her stepmother. I walked past Diane, placing myself directly between my wife and my captive daughter. "I love you, Mia," I said softly, crouching down so I was at eye level with her. "I am going to get some rest, just like Diane says, but I will be thinking about you." I reached out and gently pulled her into a hug. As I held her, I knew this was my only chance. My Apple Watch was strapped to my left wrist. It was a newer model equipped with a cellular connection, GPS tracking, and an independent voice recording function. While my right arm rubbed her back to comfort her, my left hand moved quickly and silently. With a few practiced swipes of my thumb, I activated the continuous voice memo recording. I unclasped the band, feeling the cold metal slide off my skin. Mia was wearing a thick, oversized knitted sweater. I carefully guided my hand down her side and slipped the heavy watch deep into the large front pocket of the sweater. I gave her shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze, pressing 2 fingers gently against her collarbone in a rhythm we used to use when she was a little girl. 2 quick taps. It meant I am here. Mia stiffened for a fraction of a second, then relaxed slightly into my embrace. She understood. I pulled away, keeping my expression entirely mournful. I stood up, leaning heavily on my cane. "Okay," I said, turning to Diane and sighing deeply. "Okay, let us go home. I need to lie down." Diane smiled, a triumphant glint in her dark eyes. She thought she had completely pacified me. She thought I was just a sick, gullible old man who would blindly sign away anything she asked. She had no idea that I had just planted a listening device right in the center of her impenetrable fortress. She had no idea that her perfect, quiet life was about to be burned to the absolute ground. We walked out of the room and I listened to the wall seal shut behind us, knowing that the real war had only just begun. The walk from the hidden room to the underground parking garage felt like a march to the executioner block. My legs were heavy, and my chest throbbed with a dull, steady ache, but I forced myself to put one foot in front of the other. Diane held my arm tightly, her manicured fingers digging into my bicep under the guise of supporting my weight. To anyone passing by, we looked like a devoted, wealthy couple navigating the autumn of our lives. A loving wife gently assisting her ailing older husband. It was a flawless, terrifying illusion. The cold Chicago wind swept through the concrete garage, biting at my cheeks, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the absolute ice freezing my veins. I leaned heavily on my silver-handled cane, letting my shoulders slump forward, playing the part of the shattered patriarch to absolute perfection. Diane clicked a button on her key fob, and the lights of her sleek black luxury SUV flashed in the dim garage. She opened the passenger door for me, guiding me into the plush leather seat with practiced care. I sank into the cushions, letting out a long, weary sigh. The heavy car door slammed shut instantly, cutting off the ambient noise of the city. Inside the cabin, it was completely silent, like a tomb. Diane slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard lit up with a soft blue glow, illuminating her sharp, aristocratic profile. She adjusted the climate control, ensuring the temperature was perfectly warm and comfortable for my supposedly fragile condition. She reached out and placed her warm hand over mine, giving it a gentle, reassuring squeeze. "Just close your eyes, Richard," she murmured softly, keeping her eyes on the road as we pulled out into the afternoon traffic. "You have had a massive shock today. The best thing you can do now is rest and let me handle the heavy lifting. I am going to take care of everything. I promise you, Mia is in the best possible hands. You do not need to worry about the syndicate or the cartel or any of the ugly details. That is my job as your wife, to bear the ugly things so you do not have to." I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on the passing buildings outside the tinted window. "Thank you, Diane," I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound thoroughly defeated. "I am just so tired." I closed my eyes, resting my head against the cool leather headrest. In the darkness behind my eyelids, the image of my beautiful daughter strapped to that wheelchair burned like a branding iron. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, forcing my heart rate to slow down. Outwardly, I was a defeated old man drifting off to sleep. Inwardly, the ruthless mind of a former commercial real estate chief executive officer was violently snapping back to life. I had spent 40 years building an empire in one of the most cutthroat business environments in the world. I had crushed aggressive corporate takeovers, outsmarted ruthless competitors, and navigated treacherous legal landmines. I had retired because my heart was failing, not because my brain had lost its edge. As the luxury SUV glided smoothly down the highway, I began to brutally analyze the woman sitting next to me. The scales had finally fallen from my eyes, and the clarity was blinding. Every single thing Diane had done over the past 5 years was a calculated strategic move on a chessboard I did not even know we were playing on. I remembered how she had slowly and systematically isolated me from my oldest friends. She would claim they were causing me too much stress, or that they were only interested in my money. I remembered how she had taken over my medical appointments, switching out my longtime physicians for doctors she personally recommended from her private clinic network. She had positioned herself as the absolute gatekeeper to my health, my social life, and my daily routine. It was a classic hostile takeover. She had infiltrated the target company, gained the absolute trust of the chief executive, and severed his communication lines to the outside world. Now she was moving to liquidate the assets. The power of attorney document I had seen on her desk flashed in my mind. The family trust fund was massive, holding tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets and prime real estate. Mia controlled 40% of those shares. If Diane could force Mia to sign that document under the influence of heavy sedatives, she would effectively gain control of the majority stake. With my failing health and my supposed ignorance, Diane was just days away from stealing my entire legacy and leaving my daughter to rot in a hidden medical vault. We turned onto the winding private road leading to our estate in the wealthy suburbs. The massive iron gates swung open automatically, recognizing the encrypted signal from the vehicle. As we drove up the long sweeping driveway lined with towering oak trees, I looked at the sprawling stone mansion I had built with my own hands. It used to be a sanctuary, a place of joy and warmth. Now, as the afternoon shadows stretched across the manicured lawns, the house looked like a beautiful, sprawling prison. The enemy was not outside the gates. The enemy had the keys to the front door and shared my bed. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the grand entrance. Our housekeeper, Maria, opened the heavy oak door, stepping out onto the porch with a welcoming smile. Diane hurried around the front of the SUV to help me out. She wrapped her arm around my waist, supporting me as I slowly stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway. "Oh, Mr. Richard, you look so pale," Maria said, her face falling into an expression of genuine concern as we approached the steps. "He is just feeling a little under the weather," Maria Diane said smoothly, projecting the image of a tirelessly devoted caretaker. "The drive into the city was a bit too much for his heart today. Please cancel all his evening calls and make sure the house is kept perfectly quiet. I am going to take him straight upstairs to bed." I leaned heavily on my cane, letting my feet drag slightly as we walked through the grand foyer. I took slow, shallow breaths, panting slightly as we climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase. Every step was a carefully calculated performance. I needed Diane to believe that I was physically crumbling under the weight of the emotional shock. I needed her to feel completely secure in her dominance. She led me into our master bedroom, a massive suite decorated in soft, calming tones. She helped me take off my suit jacket, carefully folding it over the back of a velvet armchair. She pulled back the heavy duvet on the king-sized bed, fluffing the pillows for me. "Lie down, darling," she whispered, kissing my forehead. "I will have Maria bring up a light dinner later. Just sleep." I climbed into the bed, pulling the covers up to my chest. I gave her one last weak, grateful smile. "I love you, Diane," I murmured. "I love you too, Richard," she replied, her voice smooth and cold. She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into shadows. The heavy bedroom door clicked shut behind her, and the lock engaged with a soft metallic snap. She had locked me in. The moment I heard her footsteps fade down the hallway, the illusion shattered. I opened my eyes, staring up at the dark ceiling. My heart was no longer fluttering with panic. It was beating with a cold, steady, lethal rhythm. The weak old man was gone. The shark had returned to the water, and I was going to tear her absolutely apart. I waited in the dark bedroom until the house was entirely silent. Then I reached into my bedside table and pulled out my personal cell phone. My hands were perfectly steady now. The adrenaline of the hunter had replaced the trembling of the victim. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the button to call Jason, my eldest son. He was 40 years old, the current chief executive officer of our family real estate empire, and the man I trusted to carry on my legacy. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was bright and professional. "Hello, Dad," he said. "How are you feeling today?" I kept my voice weak and raspy. "Jason, I need you to come to the house immediately," I rasped, coughing weakly into the receiver. "I found her, Jason. I found Mia. She is alive." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, loaded silence. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Jason finally asked, his tone shifting into something tight and guarded. "Just come here," I begged, leaning into the performance. "Please hurry." I hung up the phone and lay back against the pillows. It took Jason less than 30 minutes to arrive. I heard his heavy footsteps taking the oak stairs 2 at a time. The bedroom door flew open, and he rushed to my bedside. He looked every bit the polished corporate executive in his tailored navy suit and expensive silk tie. But his face was a mask of perfectly manufactured concern. "Dad, are you all right?" he asked, grabbing my hand. "Diane called me. She said you had a terrible shock at the clinic today. She said you saw Mia." I nodded slowly, letting a tear slip down my cheek. I saw her, Jason. Your sister is alive. She is locked in a secret room behind Diane's office. She looks terrible. She is tied to a wheelchair. Jason squeezed my hand tightly. I know, Dad, he murmured, his voice thick with fake sympathy. Diane explained everything to me on the phone on my way over. It is a tragedy. A complete nightmare. But you have to understand that Diane did this to protect us. The cartel people were going to kill her. Diane made the hardest choice a mother could make to save her life. I looked up at my son, studying his face. He was not shocked. He was not angry that his stepmother had hidden his sister for 2 years. He was already reciting the company line. I swallowed hard, pretending to struggle with the information. I know what Diane said, I whispered. But we cannot just leave her down there, Jason. She is a human being. She is your sister. She needs real doctors. She needs fresh air. I am going to call the police chief. We can get protective custody. We can move her to Chicago Memorial Hospital under an assumed name. We have the money to hire an army of private security to guard her room. We do not need to hide her in a closet like an animal. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the bedroom violently shifted. The concerned, loving son vanished in the blink of an eye. Jason dropped my hand and took a step back from the bed. His jaw clenched and his eyes grew hard and cold. You are not calling the police, Dad. He snapped, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea what kind of scandal that would cause? If the press finds out my sister is a cartel hostage hiding in a fake rehab clinic, our stock prices will absolutely plummet. The board of directors will panic. We will lose the new downtown development contracts instantly. I stared at him, letting the horrifying reality wash over me. He was not worried about Mia. He was worried about the stock prices. I pushed a little further, playing the desperate father. To hell with the stock prices, I cried out, sitting up slightly. She is my daughter. We are taking her to a hospital tonight. Jason stepped forward and pointed a rigid finger at my face. You will do no such thing, he growled, his mask slipping completely. You are not thinking clearly. Your heart is weak and your mind is failing. Diane has this entirely under control. She is a medical professional. If you try to move Mia or call the police, I will personally step in and declare you medically unfit to make decisions for this family. Do you understand me? You will sit here, you will take your pills, and you will let Diane finish what she started. I looked into the eyes of my firstborn child, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had proudly handed the keys to my empire. He was standing in my bedroom, threatening to declare me incompetent to protect a woman who was torturing his own sister. He was in on it. My own blood was part of the conspiracy. The realization felt like a physical knife twisting deep into my gut. I had spent my entire adult life building an empire for him to inherit. I had overlooked his arrogance and his endless greed because he was my son. Now he was using the power I gave him to keep his own sister locked in a cage. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his silk tie with a sickeningly calm demeanor. I am going to leave now, Dad, he said, his tone returning to that cold, corporate baseline. Diane will bring your dinner soon. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Sleep on it. By tomorrow, you will see that we are doing the right thing for everyone. He turned his back on me and walked out of the room, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I stared at the closed wooden door after Jason left. The silence in the bedroom was suffocating, heavy with the weight of my son and his ultimate betrayal. I lay perfectly still in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling. I heard the front door open and close. I heard the car engine fading down the long driveway, and then nothing but the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I waited. I had to be absolutely certain that Diane was asleep. When the clock chimed midnight, I threw off the heavy duvet. The physical ache in my chest was completely eclipsed by a burning, focused rage. I walked over to my desk and booted up my laptop. The screen cast a pale, cold light across my face. I opened the tracking application linked to my smartwatch. The GPS locator pinged instantly. A small blue dot pulsed steadily at the exact address of the downtown clinic. The watch was still with Mia. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I took a deep breath and activated the live audio feed. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only the soft hiss of digital static. Then the audio cleared. I was transported back into that sterile, hidden room. I could hear the faint rhythmic beep of a medical monitor. I could hear the shallow, ragged sound of Mia breathing. Hearing my young daughter breathe brought a fresh wave of tears, but I forced myself to focus. I leaned closer to the speakers. Suddenly, the audio spiked with the clunk of a metal lock disengaging. The door slid open. The sharp, unmistakable click of designer heels echoed through the microphone. I heard the sound of a plastic chair being dragged across the floor. Diane was sitting down next to the wheelchair. Then my laptop speakers broadcasted the distinct chime of a cell phone dialing out on speakerphone. It rang twice before someone picked up. "Are you at the house, Jason?" Diane asked, her voice stripped of all maternal affection. It was cold, sharp, and strictly business. "I just left the house," Jason replied. His voice sounded thin and strained. He was falling apart, the stress cracking his polished veneer. "It was a disaster, Diane. The old man is losing it. He was crying, begging me to call the police and move her to a hospital. I had to threaten to declare him medically incompetent just to shut him up. He is unpredictable right now. I am telling you, we pushed him too far today. Letting him see her was a massive mistake." "It was not a mistake," Diane snapped back. "You panic too easily, Jason. Your father is a weak, sentimental fool. He needed to see her broken so he would believe the cartel story. He will not call the police because he is terrified. I have his daily medication. I have his environment controlled. You just need to focus on your end of the problem." "Do we have the paperwork ready?" I heard the sound of papers shuffling. "Yes, the legal team finalized the transfer documents this afternoon," he said, breathing heavily. "But we are running out of time. The trust fund matures this Friday. If Mia does not legally sign over her 40% stake before the banks close on Friday, the automatic provisions kick in. The board of directors will be officially notified, and independent auditors will demand a face-to-face meeting with her to verify her assets. If she misses that audit, the state freezes the entire trust pending a federal investigation. We will lose absolutely everything. The money, the properties, the new downtown development. All of it will be securely locked up." I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. This entire dark nightmare was about the family trust fund. When my first wife died, I established an ironclad trust to ensure Mia would always be protected. She held 40% of our entire empire. Jason only held 20%. Jason had always resented his sister for holding the larger share. They needed her signature to legally transfer her shares to the holding company. They needed to rob her blind before the trust matured. "She will sign it," Diane said, her voice dropping to a sinister hum. "I increased her dosage tonight. The sedatives are breaking down the last of her psychological resistance. By Thursday, she will not even know her own name. She will hold the pen and she will sign exactly where I tell her to sign. You just make sure the notary is someone on our payroll, someone who will look the other way when they see her state." "I have the notary handled," Jason muttered, sounding terrified. "But what about Dad? What if he wakes up tomorrow and decides to call the police anyway? What if he fights back?" Diane let out a very soft, chilling laugh. "Let him try," she murmured. "Your father is hanging by a thread. His heart is a ticking time bomb. If he causes any more trouble, I will simply adjust his medication again. A slight increase in his blood pressure pills a little extra stress, and nature will take its course. It will be a tragic, sudden heart attack. You will be the sole heir left to pick up the pieces. We are too close to the finish line to falter now, Jason. Just hold your nerve until Friday." "I will," Jason whispered. "I will see you tomorrow." The heavy door slid shut, and the audio feed returned to the sound of labored breathing. I closed the laptop, plunging the room into total darkness. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. The timeline was set. I had until Friday to save my daughter, protect my legacy, and destroy the monsters who thought they had buried me. It was Tuesday night. The clock was ticking, and I was going to make every single second count. The glow of the laptop screen faded into pitch black, but the darkness in my bedroom was absolutely nothing compared to the vast abyss that had just opened up inside my soul. I sat motionless in the center of the cold mattress. My breathing was ragged and shallow. For a long, agonizing time, I could not even produce a single tear. The magnitude of the betrayal was simply too massive for my mind to fully comprehend all at once. It was like trying to swallow the ocean. I had suspected Diane of unspeakable cruelty. She was my second wife, someone who entered my life late, someone whose true nature could conceivably be hidden behind a decade of careful, calculated acting. But Jason was my own flesh and blood. He was the child I had held in the hospital delivery room 40 years ago. He was the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the backyard. I had watched him take his very first steps. I had paid for his expensive education, mentored him in the brutal world of commercial real estate, and voluntarily stepped down to hand him the keys to a billion-dollar empire. To realize that my own son, my firstborn child, had actively conspired to kidnap his younger sister was a psychological blow that completely shattered the foundation of my reality. As I sat in the silent, suffocating room, my memory aggressively dragged me back to the week Mia disappeared 2 years ago. I remembered the agonizing, desperate police searches. I remembered the divers dragging the freezing, murky waters of the Chicago River. And most vividly, I remembered Jason. I remembered how Jason had held me up by the shoulders when my legs gave out from the sheer weight of my grief. I remembered the tearful eulogy he delivered at Mia's memorial service. He had stood at the ornate wooden podium, looking out at a church full of our friends and business partners, and spoke eloquently about how much he loved his little sister. He had wiped a fake tear from his eye and promised to honor her memory by expanding the family charity foundation. He knew, the entire time he was hugging me and delivering that beautiful, heartbreaking speech, he knew his sister was locked inside a windowless medical vault just a few miles away. He had helped put her there. He had orchestrated the staged suicide on the bridge to clear the way. He had paid the people who faked the evidence. He had looked at his own blood, his own family, and saw nothing but an obstacle to his absolute greed. The depth of that betrayal was a cold, bottomless pit. The sheer calculating psychopathy required to look a grieving father in the eye while holding the key to his daughter's cage was beyond human comprehension. It was purely demonic. Jason had deeply resented Mia for holding 40% of the family trust fund. He had traded his own sister's freedom and sanity for complete financial dominance. I pressed the palms of my hands fiercely against my eyes, trying to physically block out the horrifying images flooding my brain. But escaping the truth was completely impossible now. The final portion of their recorded conversation kept looping relentlessly in my ears. Diane's voice, smooth as glass and cold as a razor blade, echoed in the quiet bedroom. "Do not worry, the old man will not live past this week." Those words were not a casual metaphor. They were a definitive, scheduled death sentence. I could hear the absolute lack of hesitation in her voice. There was no remorse. There was no doubt. She spoke about ending my life with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss taking out the garbage. I had trusted this woman with my fragile life, and she was actively calculating the exact moment she would stop my heart. Diane was a medical professional with unrestricted access to my daily routine, my diet, and my prescription medications. She knew exactly how damaged my heart was. She knew that any sudden spike in blood pressure could trigger a fatal arrhythmia. They had kept me alive just long enough to ensure Jason was firmly entrenched as the chief executive officer of the corporation. Now that the trust fund deadline was rapidly approaching, I was no longer a useful puppet. I was a massive, dangerous liability. If I survived the week, I might ask too many questions. I might demand to see Mia again. So Diane and Jason had simply agreed to terminate my life. The sheer practicality of their murderous plan was terrifying. Jason would not have to lift a single finger. Diane would simply tweak my dosage, serve me a poisoned glass of water with a loving smile, and watch me collapse on the living room floor. The paramedics would arrive far too late. The coroner would look at my extensive medical history and rule it a massive, tragic cardiac arrest. There would be no police investigation. There would be no autopsy if the devoted, grieving widow adamantly refused one. Jason would inherit the remaining 60% of my estate, and Mia would be forced to sign over her shares while completely out of her mind on heavy sedatives. My entire legacy, everything I had bled for over 40 arduous years, would fall seamlessly into the hands of the two monsters who murdered me. A strange, terrifying calm began to wash over me. The grief and the debilitating shock were suddenly pushed aside by a primal biological instinct to survive. The vulnerable, heartbroken father who had walked into that clinic this afternoon was officially dead. Diane and Jason had killed him. The man sitting in the dark bedroom was the ruthless corporate predator who had built a massive real estate empire from absolute scratch. I had crushed ruthless competitors who tried to bankrupt me. I had destroyed corporate spies who tried to steal my blueprints. Now my ultimate competitors were sleeping under my own roof. They thought I was incredibly weak. They thought I was a fragile, sentimental old man waiting quietly for the Grim Reaper to arrive. They believed their own lie. But they had fundamentally miscalculated. They had forgotten who built the massive throne they were currently trying to steal. I slowly swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood up in the heavy darkness. My chest still ached with a dull throb, but my mind was sharper than it had been in an entire decade. I knew they were planning to kill me this week. I knew they were using my daily medication to do it. The game had completely changed. I could not afford to make a single mistake. One wrong look, one misplaced word, and Diane would instantly accelerate her deadly timeline. I had to continue playing the pathetic, broken victim while secretly building a guillotine for them both. I was no longer just trying to save my missing daughter. I was fighting a desperate ticking clock to save my own life. I walked toward the master bathroom, leaving my cane behind. It was time to look closely at the weapon they planned to use against me. I stepped barefoot onto the cold marble floor of the master bathroom. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. Instead, I reached for the small brass switch under the vanity mirror, allowing only a dim yellow glow to wash over the sink. I stared at my reflection in the glass. I looked haggard. My skin was drawn tight over my cheekbones, and dark purple shadows bruised the skin beneath my eyes. I looked exactly like a dying man. For months, Diane had stood behind me in this very mirror, brushing my shoulders and telling me how brave I was for fighting such a severe cardiac decline. Every word was a calculated piece of the murder plot. I opened the heavy mahogany medicine cabinet. The glass shelves were lined with an army of amber prescription bottles. Diane was meticulous about my regimen. She organized my pills into a plastic daily dispenser every Sunday night. She always insisted on handing me my morning and evening doses personally. I reached out and bypassed the plastic dispenser, going straight for the primary bottle of my blood pressure medication, hidden behind a row of harmless vitamins. I grasped the plastic cylinder and twisted the child-proof cap off. The faint rattle of the pills echoed loudly in the quiet bathroom. I poured a handful of the small white capsules into the center of my palm. At first glance, they looked entirely normal. They were the exact same size and shape as the medication I had been taking for the past 5 years. But I brought my hand closer to the dim light under the vanity mirror. I squinted, analyzing the surface of the capsules with the hyper-focused scrutiny of a man whose life depended on the details. The pharmaceutical capsules I had always taken were supposed to have a smooth, glossy finish with a tiny serial number printed in blue ink along the side. The pills resting in my trembling palm were slightly chalky. The blue ink was missing. And as I gently rubbed one of the capsules between my thumb and forefinger, the outer shell easily gave way. It was not a solid factory-pressed pill. It was a cheap, generic gel casing that had been manually pressed together. I carefully pulled the two halves of the capsule apart over the white porcelain sink. A fine white powder spilled out. I leaned in closely. My prescribed medication was supposed to be a solid time-release tablet. This was a loose, grainy substance with tiny flecks of a pale yellow chemical mixed into the white dust. I moistened the tip of my pinky finger, lightly touching the powder and bringing it to the very edge of my tongue. The taste was overwhelmingly bitter metallic and completely foreign. I immediately spat it out into the sink, thoroughly rinsing my mouth with cold tap water. My chest heaved as the horrifying reality slammed into my brain. Diane was systematically poisoning me. She was opening empty gel capsules, filling them with an untraceable narcotic or a dangerous cardiac stimulant, and feeding them to me under the guise of life-saving medicine. Suddenly, every single mysterious health scare over the past 6 months made perfect, terrifying sense. I remembered the afternoon I had collapsed in the garden, my heart fluttering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. Diane had rushed to my side, claiming my blood pressure had inexplicably spiked. I remembered the constant dizzy spells, the suffocating shortness of breath, and the crushing fatigue that kept me confined to my bed for days at a time. My doctors were baffled by my rapid decline. But Diane was always there, shaking her head and whispering about the natural progression of heart disease. My disease was not progressing naturally. My disease was my wife. She was meticulously calculating the exact dosage required to weaken my heart muscle without triggering an immediate fatal arrest before the trust fund documents were securely signed. She was breaking down my body day by day, dose by poisonous dose, making sure I appeared to be a failing old man to everyone around us. She was paving the perfect alibi. When my heart finally gave out completely, no one would question it. The coroner would see a long, documented history of cardiac decay. Jason would play the grieving son, and Diane would play the devastated widow who tried everything in her medical power to save me. It was a flawless, undetectable murder. I looked down at the lethal powder scattered across the white porcelain sink. A surge of violent primal anger rushed through my veins, completely wiping away any remaining traces of the frail old man. At that exact moment, I realized I was no longer a father trying to mend a broken family. I was the prey caught in a deadly trap set by the people I had trusted most in the world. But the prey had just figured out how the trap worked. I carefully reassembled the remaining capsules and placed them back into the amber bottle. I could not simply flush the poison down the toilet. If Diane noticed her deadly stash was missing, she would instantly know I was onto her. She would realize the game was up, and she would find a faster, more brutal way to finish me off. I had to let her believe she was still entirely in control of my fate. I had to let her believe her poison was working. I placed the amber bottle exactly where I had found it, on the glass shelf, closing the medicine cabinet with a soft click. I stood in the dim bathroom and formulated my plan. It was Wednesday morning. I had less than 48 hours before they forced Mia to sign away her life and then inevitably killed me. I could not go to the police yet. If I called the authorities, Diane would immediately destroy the evidence and claim Mia was a willing patient in her clinic. Jason would use his massive corporate influence to bury the investigation. I needed undeniable proof. I needed a legal weapon so devastating that they could never escape it. And more importantly, I needed to get out of this house alive. I walked back into the dark bedroom, staring at the empty spot on the mattress where my wife usually slept. Tomorrow morning, I was going to give Diane exactly what she wanted. I was going to take her poisoned pill right in front of her smiling face. And then I was going to unleash absolute hell. I awoke the next morning to the sound of curtains being drawn back. Sunlight flooded the room. Diane stood by the window in a pressed silk robe, her hair styled. She turned with that familiar loving smile, holding a tray with coffee and my morning medication. "Good morning, darling," she murmured, her voice laced with an affection that turned my stomach into knots. "How did you sleep?" I forced my facial muscles to relax. "Not very well," I rasped, making sure my voice sounded weak and breathless. "My chest feels incredibly tight." Diane's eyes flashed with a microscopic glimmer of dark satisfaction before she masked it with wifely concern. "Oh, Richard, you pushed yourself too hard yesterday," she said, setting the tray down. She picked up the plastic cup containing the poisoned capsule. "You need to take your medicine right now. It will stabilize your heart rate." I slowly pushed myself up against the headboard, letting out a convincing groan of discomfort. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the cup from her fingers. She stood beside the bed watching me intently. I knew I had to make this look flawless. I brought the cup to my lips, tossing the white capsule backward. But instead of swallowing it, I tucked it deep into the pocket of my cheek, right behind my lower teeth. I immediately grabbed the water and took 3 large gulps, swallowing heavily to sell the illusion. I handed the glass back, offering a grateful nod. "Thank you, Diane," I whispered. She smiled gently, brushing hair from my sweaty forehead. "You just rest now," she said softly. "I will go downstairs and have Maria prepare oatmeal for you. I will be right back." As soon as she walked out the door, I spat the gel capsule into a tissue and shoved it into my pocket. The countdown had begun. I needed to give her a few minutes, enough time for her to believe the deadly powder was entering my bloodstream. I lay staring at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing the symptoms of a massive myocardial infarction. I had survived a real heart attack 5 years ago. I knew exactly what it felt like. I remembered the suffocating weight, the inability to breathe, and the paralyzing agony radiating down the left arm. I had to reproduce that medical emergency perfectly, or she would finish the job with a pillow. I waited exactly 4 minutes. Then I threw the duvet off and swung out of bed. I stood up, took a deep breath, and let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. I violently swept my arm across the bedside table, sending the tray, coffee cup, and brass lamp crashing to the floor with a deafening shatter. I collapsed onto the ground, gripping my chest with both hands, curling into a tight ball. I began to gasp for air, making choking sounds in my throat. My acting was fueled by genuine rage, which made the physical tremors racking my body entirely believable. I heard the rapid, frantic sound of footsteps pounding up the mahogany staircase. Richard, Diane screamed, bursting through the bedroom door. She dropped to her knees beside me, her hands hovering over my violently shaking body. "Oh my God! Richard, what is happening?" I did not answer her. I kept my eyes squeezed tightly shut, letting a thin trail of saliva leak from the corner of my mouth. I arched my back, panting rapidly, clawing at the fabric of my pajama shirt directly over my heart. "Help me," I wheezed, forcing my voice to sound incredibly faint and strangled. "I cannot breathe. It hurts so much." Diane immediately pulled her cell phone from her robe pocket and dialed emergency services. I cracked my right eye open just a fraction of an inch, peering up at her from the floor. Her voice was pure panic as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, please, you have to hurry. My husband is having a massive heart attack. He has a history of severe cardiac disease. Our address is 400 Oakwood Drive. Please send an ambulance immediately. He is turning blue." She sounded like the most terrified, devoted wife in the world. But as she listened to the dispatcher give her instructions, I saw the truth. She looked down at my writhing body, believing I was entirely consumed by the pain, and her mask completely slipped. The frantic panic on her face vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating, and utterly sinister smirk. She was smiling. She was watching me die, and she was absolutely thrilled. "Hold on, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with fake terror for the benefit of the recorded emergency line. "The ambulance is on the way. Just stay with me." I closed my eye again, continuing my desperate performance. 10 agonizing minutes passed before the loud, piercing wail of sirens echoed up the driveway. I heard the front door bang open, followed by the heavy boots of paramedics charging up the stairs. They swarmed into the bedroom, instantly pushing Diane aside. I felt professional hands checking my pulse. "We need to load him up right now," one paramedic shouted loudly. "Get the stretcher in here." They hoisted me onto the canvas gurney, strapping me down tightly. Diane hovered nearby, playing the devastated widow perfectly. "I am coming with him," she sobbed. "No, ma'am," the lead paramedic commanded firmly. "There is no room in the back. Follow us in your car." The paramedics grabbed the stretcher, rushing me out of the bedroom and out the front doors. The crisp morning air hit my face as they loaded me into the back of the ambulance. The metal doors slammed shut completely, cutting off the sight of my treacherous wife. The sirens wailed and the ambulance violently accelerated down the driveway. I was finally out of her house. I had completely escaped her dark surveillance. The final trap was sprung, and now I was completely ready for total war. The ride in the ambulance was a blur of flashing red lights and the wailing siren cutting through morning traffic. The paramedics worked frantically over me, convinced my heart was failing. I kept my eyes closed, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, maintaining the illusion of a dying man. When we arrived at Chicago Memorial Hospital, the rear doors flew open, and I was rushed into the chaotic emergency department. Bright overhead lights passed by in a dizzying sequence. Nurses and doctors shouted medical jargon, attaching electrodes to my chest and inserting an intravenous line into my arm. I could hear Diane's voice in the distance echoing down the sterile hallway, playing the role of the hysterical, grieving wife. She demanded to stay by my side, but hospital protocol was strict. Because my supposed condition was critical, they transferred me directly to the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit hissed shut securely, locking Diane out in the waiting area. The charge nurse firmly explained to her that no visitors were allowed until the patient was stabilized. I was finally alone, separated from my treacherous wife by reinforced glass and strict hospital policy. They wheeled me into a private room, the heavy door sliding closed behind us. A young cardiologist stood at the foot of my bed, staring at the digital monitor, displaying my vital signs. He frowned, looking confused. According to the paramedics, I was having a massive myocardial infarction. But the monitor showed my heart rate was steady. My blood pressure was normal. There was no sign of cardiac distress. I opened my eyes, dropped the grimace, and sat up against the pillows. The doctor jumped back in shock. I looked him dead in the eye. "Listen to me carefully," I said, my voice completely clear. "I am not having a heart attack. I am in extreme danger, and my wife is trying to murder me. I need you to lock that door, and I need a secure telephone right this second." The doctor was stunned, but my commanding tone left absolutely no room for argument. He handed me the receiver of the landline next to the bed and quietly stepped out of the room, securing the heavy door behind him. I dialed a private number I had memorized decades ago. It belonged to Bradley Reed. Bradley was officially listed as the senior legal counsel for my corporation, but that title was merely a polite facade. Bradley was my brother in arms. We had forged our empire together in the ruthless real estate markets of the 1980s and 90s. Back then, it was a brutal game of survival, and Bradley was the sharpest, most merciless weapon in my arsenal. He was the man I called when a rival developer tried to bribe city officials to block our permits. He was the man who orchestrated hostile takeovers that left our competitors bankrupt and begging for mercy. Bradley did not play by the rules of corporate law. He was a shark who thrived in the bloodiest waters. We had fought back-to-back in boardrooms and courtrooms for 40 years. I trusted him with my life, and I trusted his absolute capacity for professional violence. The phone rang only twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Reed here," he barked. "Bradley, it is Richard," I said, keeping my voice low but urgent. The moment he heard my tone, the atmosphere of the call shifted. "You are supposed to be in a hospital bed, Richard," he replied smoothly. "I just got a frantic call from Jason. He said you collapsed from a massive heart attack and are fighting for your life in the intensive care unit. Jason is already calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow to assume full control of the holding company. I let out a dark chuckle. That is exactly what they want you to believe, I told him. Listen to me, Bradley. I do not have a lot of time before the hospital staff forces Diane into this room. I need you to activate every legal and security resource we have right now. Mia is alive. There was a heavy, stunned silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb detonates. Bradley had treated Mia like his own niece since she was a little girl. Did you hear me, Bradley? I pressed. My daughter is alive. Diane and Jason staged her disappearance 2 years ago. They are holding her hostage in a hidden medical vault behind Diane's private clinic. They are heavily sedating her to force her to sign over her 40% stake in the family trust fund before it matures this Friday. And Diane has been poisoning my daily medication to ensure I drop dead before I can stop them. I faked this heart attack to get out of the house alive. I am locked in the intensive care unit at Chicago Memorial, and my wife is in the waiting room waiting for a doctor to tell her I am dead. I heard Bradley take a slow, deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice was devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of the corporate executioner I had not heard in over a decade. Richard, he said quietly, I am going to burn their entire world to the ground. Tell me exactly what you need me to do. I gripped the plastic receiver tightly. First, keep Diane locked out of this hospital room permanently. Tell the administration you have my medical power of attorney. Tell them she is a physical danger to me. Second, gather an elite private security detail. Do not use regular company guards. Hire outside contractors, ex-military men, former federal agents, people who do not ask questions. Third, completely freeze Jason out of all the corporate accounts before he can leverage that board meeting tomorrow. We are going straight to war. I hung up the phone and waited. The sterile white clock on the intensive care unit wall seemed to tick in slow motion. 45 minutes later, a subtle commotion echoed from the hallway outside my sealed room. I heard Diane's muffled voice, shrill and demanding, followed by a deep, authoritative rumble that I instantly recognized. The heavy door hissed open. Bradley Reed stepped inside, shutting it firmly, before Diane could even catch a glimpse of me. He looked exactly the same as he did in the boardroom 10 years ago. Impeccably tailored gray suit, silver hair swept back, and eyes as sharp and cold as shattered glass. He was carrying a thick, black leather briefcase. He did not ask how I was feeling. He pulled a chair to the side of my bed, snapped the latches of the briefcase open, and withdrew a stack of dense legal documents. We do not have time for pleasantries, Richard Bradley said, handing me a sleek silver pen. The hospital administration has been officially notified that I hold your supreme medical and legal power of attorney. Diane has been legally barred from making any decisions regarding your care or your visitors. Now I need your signature on these 3 pages. The first document immediately revokes any and all proxy powers currently held by Jason. The second document places the entire holding company into an emergency lockdown under my direct supervision. The third document is a formal declaration that you are of sound mind and body, effectively neutralizing any attempt they might make to declare you medically incompetent. I took the pen and signed my name on the dotted lines. My signature was not the shaky scrawl of a dying old man. It was the bold, aggressive stroke of a chief executive officer taking his empire back. As I handed the papers back, Bradley pulled out a secure tablet and began rapidly typing. While you were resting, I had my forensic accountants quietly probe Jason's recent corporate activities, Bradley explained, without looking up. Your son has been sloppy. He was so confident in his impending succession that he left a massive digital trail. I am currently executing an absolute financial freeze on all of Jason's executive accounts. In exactly 5 minutes, his corporate credit cards will be declined. His access to the company's master ledgers will be revoked, and his digital keycard to the executive penthouse will be deactivated. He will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee using company funds. We are cutting off his air supply before he even realizes he is suffocating. And what about Diane? I asked, the bitter taste of the poisoned pill still lingering in my memory. Bradley offered a grim, satisfied smile. Diane is a slightly more complicated target, but she is far from invincible. I tracked the private funds she used to establish her wellness clinic. She has been funneling money into 3 separate offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She thought they were completely untraceable. She was wrong. Through a series of aggressive legal injunctions, leveraging international fraud statutes, I have managed to freeze those offshore accounts completely. Her personal wealth is currently locked in a judicial purgatory. When she tries to access her escape funds, she will find absolutely nothing but empty digital vaults. They are both entirely paralyzed, Richard. Now we need the muscle. Just as he finished speaking, the door to the intensive care unit room opened again. This time it was not a doctor or a nurse. 2 men walked in, moving with the quiet, lethal grace of apex predators. They wore dark, nondescript suits, but everything about their posture screamed military training. Bradley gestured to the taller of the 2 men. Richard, this is Marcus. He is a former tactical commander for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he currently runs the most elite private security firm in the state. Marcus stepped forward and offered a firm, calloused hand. I shook it, feeling the raw, coiled strength in his grip. Mr. Richard Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. Bradley has briefed us on the situation regarding your daughter. We have a team of 12 operatives currently mobilizing downtown. I need her out of that clinic, I told Marcus, looking him directly in the eye. I need my daughter pulled out of that hidden room safely, and I need the people holding her there completely neutralized. Marcus nodded slowly. A direct, violent breach of a private medical facility in downtown Chicago would draw immediate police attention and create a massive hostage situation, he explained. We need a tactical cover to get our men inside without triggering alarms or giving your wife the opportunity to harm Mia. We have secured forged credentials from the State Department of Public Health. Tomorrow morning, my men will enter the clinic posing as a specialized state inspection team, conducting an unannounced audit of controlled medical substances. This cover gives us the legal pretext to lock down the entire building, separate the staff, and secure the perimeter before Diane and Jason even know they are under attack. It was a brilliant, ruthlessly efficient plan. Diane's entire operation relied on the absolute secrecy and pristine reputation of her clinic. A state health inspection would force her to play the compliant professional director, keeping her distracted, while Marcus and his operatives quietly dismantled her fortress from the inside out. Bradley closed his briefcase with a loud, definitive snap. The trap is officially set. Jason is financially crippled. Diane's escape routes are severed, and we have a highly trained strike team ready to breach the clinic tomorrow morning. But you cannot stay here. If Diane gets desperate, she might try to bypass hospital security. I have arranged a secure private medical transport. We are moving you to a safe house heavily guarded by Marcus's men. We will monitor the entire operation from there. The private medical transport was a masterpiece of covert logistics. Within an hour, I was wheeled out of the hospital through a subterranean service elevator, completely bypassing the main waiting area where Diane was still playing her tragic role. The back of the heavily armored ambulance was dimly lit and smelled of clean steel. Marcus sat across from me, his eyes constantly scanning the street through the tinted rear window. Every rotation of the tires brought us closer to the absolute deadline. It was Thursday evening. We had exactly 12 hours before the Friday morning deadline. 12 hours before the banks opened, before the trust fund matured, and before Diane forced my heavily sedated daughter to sign her life away. The tension inside the moving vehicle was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I stared at the digital clock mounted on the bulkhead, watching the red numbers tick down. Each passing second was a drop of blood leaking from my own family legacy. We arrived at a nondescript industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. From the outside, it looked entirely abandoned. But as the heavy steel bay doors rolled open and we drove inside, a state-of-the-art tactical command center was revealed. Banks of computer monitors cast a cold blue light across the concrete floor. Marcus' team of ex-federal operatives moved with quiet, focused efficiency, tracking live feeds and establishing encrypted communication networks. Bradley was already there, spreading blueprints of the wellness clinic across a large metal folding table. I stepped out of the transport vehicle, refusing the wheelchair the medics offered. My chest was sore from the aggressive treatment in the emergency room, but the adrenaline surging through my veins was a more powerful stimulant than anything Diane had ever slipped into my coffee. However, before I could go to war, I needed one final piece of armor. A private physician, thoroughly vetted by Bradley, was waiting for me in a small office partitioned off from the main warehouse floor. I sat on the examination table while he conducted a rigorous physical and cognitive evaluation. He drew my blood, checked my heart rhythms, and ran through a long battery of complex neurological tests. I needed documented, undeniable medical proof that I was perfectly lucid and physically capable of making complex legal and financial decisions. When the doctor finally clicked his pen and signed the official discharge papers declaring me in sound mind and body, a massive weight lifted from my shoulders. Jason's threat to declare me medically incompetent was now officially null and void. I had the medical clearance and I had the legal authority. Now I just needed to prepare the execution. I walked out of the makeshift medical bay and joined Bradley at the tactical table. He handed me a sleek black folder containing the final devastating weapons of our counterattack. These were not firearms. They were something much more lethal in our world. They were irrevocable legal decrees. Richard Bradley said, tracing a finger over a satellite image of the clinic. The building Diane operates out of is registered under a shell corporation, but the actual land beneath it is still owned by your primary real estate holding group. You never transferred the deed. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. I had purposely kept the land deed in my name years ago as a minor tax strategy, completely forgetting about it until Bradley unearthed the documents this afternoon. That oversight was about to become Diane's ultimate undoing. Because I owned the land, I had the absolute legal right to shut down the facility, revoke the lease instantly under emergency provisions, and cut the power grid to the entire building. They were trapped inside a fortress built on my soil. Bradley tapped another document. I also have the court orders prepared. The moment we breach that clinic, these papers will officially strip Jason of his executive title and seize every single asset he falsely claimed. We have his financial throat in our hands. You just have to give the signal to squeeze. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the warehouse office. I was no longer wearing the pathetic, frail hospital gown. Marcus had procured a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark crimson tie. I dressed slowly, fastening the buttons with steady fingers. Every piece of clothing felt like a plate of heavy armor. I tied the silk knot at my throat, staring into my own eyes. The weak, grieving father who had wept in Diane's office was gone forever. The man staring back at me was the ruthless titan of Chicago real estate, returning from the dead to reclaim his stolen kingdom. I strapped my platinum watch to my wrist. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. The Friday sun would be rising soon. In a few hours, Diane and Jason would gather in that sterile room, holding a pen to me, a trembling hand, believing they had finally won the grand prize. They believed I was lying in a hospital bed, taking my final breaths. They were totally unprepared for the absolute hurricane that was about to hit them. I walked back to the center of the room where Marcus and his tactical team were loading their gear and reviewing the clinic floor plans. The atmosphere was electric with anticipated violence. Bradley stood silently by the door, holding his leather briefcase like an executioner holding an axe. I stood at the head of the table, looking at the hardened men who were about to help me rescue my daughter and destroy my betrayers. The countdown had reached its absolute end. There was no more time for planning. There was no more time for fear. "Gentlemen," I said quietly, my voice echoing coldly off the concrete walls, "it is finally time to go. Let us show my wife and my son exactly what happens when you decide to wake the dead." The morning sun had barely begun to scrape the tops of the Chicago skyscrapers when our tactical convoy pulled onto the quiet street outside the private wellness clinic. It was exactly 7 in the morning. The financial markets would open in 2 hours. Diane and Jason were already inside, completely unaware that the executioner they thought they had successfully buried was currently sitting in a blacked-out suburban idling just 50 feet from their front door. I watched through this dark-tinted glass as the local county sheriff pulled his cruiser into the alleyway, cutting the siren and lights to maintain absolute stealth. Bradley had called in a massive political favor, presenting the sheriff with enough preliminary evidence of kidnapping, wire fraud, and extortion to secure his full armed cooperation. We were not just going to stop a financial transaction this morning. We were going to dismantle a ruthless criminal enterprise from the ground up. Marcus and his highly trained team of former federal operatives moved with a terrifying silent precision. They exited their unmarked vehicles wearing dark windbreakers with the state health department insignia officially emblazoned on the back. They carried official clipboards covering their holstered weapons. I watched them walk calmly through the heavy glass doors of the clinic lobby. Through the secure earpiece Marcus had given me, I listened to the live audio of the tactical infiltration. I heard the sharp, authoritative voice of the lead operative informing the receptionist that they were executing an emergency unannounced audit of the facility-controlled narcotics registry. The receptionist sounded flustered, protesting that Dr. Diane was in a private closed-door session and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. Marcus did not argue with her. He simply ordered his men to quickly secure the perimeter, confiscate the lobby telephones, and magnetically lock the main entrances. In less than 3 agonizing minutes, the entire front half of the clinic was entirely under our tactical control, and not a single alarm had been tripped to warn the monsters in the back. "It is clear," Marcus said softly in my earpiece. "Bring the package to the front." The package was me. I stepped out of the armored vehicle, the cold morning air biting sharply at my face. Bradley walked closely at my right shoulder, clutching his thick leather briefcase like a weapon. The sheriff walked on my left, his hand resting casually on his heavy utility belt. As I confidently walked through the glass doors of the lobby, the terrified receptionist violently gasped, dropping a massive stack of medical intake forms onto the floor. She had personally seen me wheeled out of here on a stretcher just 2 days ago, looking exactly like a frail corpse. Now I was walking past her front desk with the cold, rigid posture of a conquering general. I did not say a single word to her. I kept my eyes completely fixed on the long, pristine hallway leading directly to Diane's executive office. Every deliberate step I took felt like a heavy steel hammer striking an anvil. The heavy fog of my manufactured heart condition, the suffocating weakness that plagued me for months, was entirely gone. Pure adrenaline fueled my aging body. We reached the solid mahogany door of Diane's office. Marcus held up a clenched fist, signaling us to stop our advance. He pressed a specialized medical stethoscope against the wood, listening to the muffled activity inside. I did not need his listening device. I still had the live audio feed from the smartwatch I planted in Mia's pocket, connecting directly to my hidden earpiece. I closed my eyes and tuned into the horrific, heartbreaking scene unfolding just a few feet away. "Pick up the pen right now," Jason hissed aggressively through the audio feed. His voice sounded incredibly strained, laced with a toxic mixture of financial panic and deep, terrifying cruelty. "The banks open in exactly 1 hour. You are going to sign the final trust fund transfer, and then you are going to sign this $15 million cashier check to cover the remaining corporate liabilities. Pick the pen up." I heard the weak, pathetic sound of my daughter sobbing uncontrollably. "I cannot." Mia whimpered, her voice slurring heavily from the massive dose of illegal sedatives Diane had pumped into her fragile system. "Please let me sleep." "Stop crying and hold her wrist tightly," Diane commanded. Her tone was completely devoid of human empathy. It was the voice of a butcher giving cold instructions on the slaughterhouse floor. I will physically guide her hand if I have to. Wrap your fingers around the pen, Mia, or I swear I will double your chemical dosage and leave you strapped in this chair for another 2 miserable years. Do you want to rot down here forever? Sign the damn check right now. Hearing my wife and my son torture my helpless daughter shattered the final restraint I had left in my soul. I opened my eyes. I did not wait to give Marcus the signal to breach. I simply stepped past the armed federal operatives, raised my right leg, and kicked the heavy mahogany door with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The heavy brass lock violently splintered. The solid wooden door flew inward with a deafening explosive crash, slamming against the plaster wall so hard that framed medical degrees shattered onto the hardwood floor. The sudden noise ripped through the quiet office like a bomb detonating. I stepped boldly through the ruined threshold. The scene in front of me was perfectly frozen in absolute terror. The hidden bookshelf wall was pulled wide open. Mia was slumped heavily in her wheelchair. Jason was standing directly over her, violently gripping her thin wrist. Diane stood beside them, holding a medical syringe. They stared at me in pure horror. Jason dropped her wrist, stumbling backward into the window. "My heart is perfectly fine," I said, "and your brutal reign over this family is officially over." The syringe slipped from Diane's trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp plastic clatter, rolling away into the shadows. Jason backed up so hard against the floor-to-ceiling window that the thick glass actually bowed outward. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer, who had threatened to declare me medically incompetent, was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified little boy staring at a ghost. Diane was the first to partially recover her composure, though the pale color completely drained from her aristocratic face. "Richard," she stammered, her voice thin and wavering, completely stripped of its usual melodic control. "What are you doing here? You had a massive heart attack. You are supposed to be in the intensive care unit. The hospital called me. They said you were not receiving visitors. That was a highly coordinated medical fabrication, Diane," I replied, stepping further into the room. I walked slowly, moving with the deliberate, heavy grace of a judge approaching the bench. I did not need a cane. My posture was perfectly straight. "I did not take your poisoned pill yesterday morning. I hid it in my cheek, spat it out, and orchestrated my own extraction from the prison you called our home. You thought you were feeding me a slow, undetectable death, but all you did was give me the precise evidence I needed to hang you." Jason finally found his voice, though it was a high, reedy squeak. "Dad, you do not understand. We are helping her. Mia is very sick. The cartel was coming for her. We were just trying to secure the trust fund so they could not touch the family assets. Do not ever speak her name again." I roared, my voice vibrating with a fury so profound it seemed to shake the framed certificates still hanging on the walls. "I heard the audio recording, Jason. I planted a listening device in Mia's pocket when I was here on Tuesday. I heard you both plotting to steal her 40% stake. I heard Diane promise you that I would not survive the week. There is no cartel. There is no syndicate. There is only a greedy, treacherous son and a murderous stepmother." Bradley Reed stepped into the room, moving past me with the cold, clinical efficiency of an undertaker. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on Diane's glass desk, unfastened the brass latches with 2 loud clicks, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy legal paper. I reached out, took the documents from Bradley, and threw them violently at Jason's feet. The heavy papers scattered across the floor, sliding over the Persian rug in a messy white fan. "Pick them up, Jason," I commanded. "Read the future you built for yourself." Jason dropped to his knees, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the pages. His eyes darted rapidly across the bold, legal print. I watched the remaining blood drain from his face as he processed the dense corporate terminology. As of 6 o'clock this morning, you are completely severed from the holding company. I explained, my tone absolutely merciless. Every single executive account tied to your name has been permanently frozen. Your corporate credit cards are currently declining. Your digital access to the penthouse suite is wiped. You have no legal proxy, no voting rights, and absolutely no financial leverage anywhere. You are standing in the clothes you are wearing, and that is all you have left in this world. Jason let out a pathetic, strangled sob, dropping the papers. Dad, please, he begged, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. You cannot do this. I am your son. I built the new downtown development. I am the face of this company. You were the face of my company, I corrected him coldly. Now you are just an unemployed criminal facing decades in federal prison. Diane suddenly lunged forward, her survival instincts violently kicking into high gear. She stepped protectively in front of her glass desk, her eyes flashing with a desperate, cornered fury. You cannot barge into my private medical facility and threaten us. Richard, she spat, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. This is my clinic. I am the medical director here. I have rights. I want you and your hired thugs out of my building right now, or I am calling the police to report an armed invasion. I looked at the local county sheriff, who was standing quietly in the doorway, his arms folded across his chest. He just shook his head slowly, looking at Diane with profound disgust. You do not own this building, Diane, I said, taking a slow, menacing step toward her. She instinctively recoiled, her back hitting the edge of her desk. You registered your little shell corporation to lease this property, but you never actually checked who owned the dirt beneath the foundation. I kept the primary land deed in my personal portfolio 30 years ago. I am your landlord. And as your landlord, having discovered illegal narcotics distribution, kidnapping, and attempted murder taking place on my property, I am executing an immediate, irrevocable emergency eviction. Diane's eyes widened in absolute shock. She looked wildly around the room, frantically searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. Furthermore, I continued raising my hand to signal Marcus, who was standing in the hallway monitoring the entire operation. This facility is no longer operational. Marcus brought his secure radio to his lips. Cut the grid entirely, he ordered calmly. Instantly, the bright fluorescent lights illuminating the office flickered and died. The steady hum of the central air conditioning ground to a sudden halt. The digital displays on the monitors in the hidden room blinked off. The sudden loss of power plunged the room into a heavy, suffocating darkness for only a fraction of a second before the dim amber glow of the emergency backup lights flickered to life. The pale illumination cast long, distorted shadows across the mahogany walls, turning Diane and Jason into grotesque silhouettes of their former selves. The heavy silence in the office was broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of Jason panting. He pushed himself away from the thick glass window, taking a stumbling step toward me. His face was twisted into a pathetic mask of defiant arrogance, a desperate attempt to cling to the power that was rapidly dissolving in his hands. You cannot do this to me, Dad, he shouted, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. You are completely out of your mind. I am the chief executive officer of the family holding company. I have a legally binding employment contract. The board of directors officially elected me. You cannot simply walk in here with a private security team and strip me of my title. I will take you to court. I will sue you for absolutely everything you have left. I stood perfectly still, letting his hollow threats wash over me like rain against a solid brick wall. I simply took a step to the side and allowed Bradley Reed to take the floor. Bradley adjusted his silver tie, his expression radiating pure, unfiltered contempt. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and slowly withdrew a single slim red folder. It stood out like a drop of fresh blood against the dark mahogany desk. You are not going to sue anyone. Jason Bradley stated, his voice a smooth, lethal purr. You are going to quietly drop to your knees and pray that your father does not hand this specific folder directly to the federal authorities. Jason froze, his eyes locked onto the red folder. A new, much deeper layer of panic began to actively bleed through his aggressive facade. "What is that?" he stammered, taking a small, involuntary step backward. Bradley opened the folder with deliberate slowness. "This is a comprehensive forensic accounting report, detailing the massive gaping hole in the corporate development fund over the last 24 months. You thought you were incredibly clever, Jason. You routed the money through a dozen different shell corporations, disguising the massive withdrawals as independent contractor fees for the new downtown project. But you left digital fingerprints everywhere. You embezzled $12 million of company money." Jason shook his head rapidly, his hands trembling. "No, that is a lie," he whispered frantically. "That money was a legitimate investment. I was covering overhead costs. You are making this up to ruin me." Bradley let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You did not invest a single dime of that money, Jason. You blew it. You have a severe, crippling addiction to high-stakes underground gambling. We tracked the wire transfers to an illicit betting syndicate operating out of an offshore server. You lost millions on illegal sports betting and underground poker tables. You borrowed heavily on margin to chase your massive losses, and when the debt collectors came knocking, you panicked and started stealing directly from your own family to keep them from breaking your legs." I watched my son closely. His entire body sagged as the truth was brutally dragged out into the harsh light. The polished, successful businessman completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, sweating, gambling addict. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I am so sorry." He sobbed, his voice breaking into pieces. "They were going to kill me. The loan sharks, the syndicate. They threatened my life. They told me I had to pay them back with massive interest, or they would destroy me entirely. I had to take the money. Diane said she could help me hide the corporate transfers. She said she could protect me from the cartel if I just helped her secure Mia and the trust fund. It was at that exact moment that the ultimate devastating truth finally dropped onto the room like a heavy steel anvil." Bradley slowly closed the red folder and turned his cold, piercing gaze toward Diane. Diane was standing perfectly still behind her desk, her face entirely devoid of emotion, her eyes dark and completely unreadable. "There is no cartel," Jason Bradley said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "There is no mysterious offshore syndicate threatening your life." Jason blinked rapidly, thoroughly confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I spoke to them. I wired the money directly to their accounts." Bradley pointed a long, rigid finger directly at Diane. "You wired the money to a series of blind trusts registered in the Cayman Islands. The exact same offshore accounts that I legally froze this morning. Do you not completely understand, Jason? The ruthless loan shark who held your massive gambling debt, the violent syndicate that threatened your life and forced you to kidnap your own sister, is standing right in front of you." The silence in the office became absolute. Jason slowly turned his head to look at his stepmother. His breath hitched violently in his throat. Diane did not flinch at all. She simply stared back at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a venomous reptile. "You," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "You were the one taking my bets. You were the one charging me the massive interest rates." Diane slowly straightened her blazer, a cruel, mocking smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You were a pathetic, weak-minded fool, Jason," she said softly. "I just let you keep playing until you willingly handed me the keys to your father and his empire." Jason let out a hollow, agonizing wail of pure, unadulterated psychological agony. His knees violently buckled, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, crying. He traded his soul for nothing. The game was finally over for him. As he knelt on the cold hardwood floor, the heavy silence in the room began to dangerously shift. The crushing weight of Jason's absolute despair slowly mutated into something entirely different. I watched the terrifying transformation happen in real time. The tears streaming down his pale, sweating face suddenly stopped. His breath, which had been coming in rapid, panicked gasps, slowed and deepened into heavy, ragged pulls of air. He looked down at his trembling hands, the exact same hands he had just used to violently force his heavily sedated sister to sign away her life, and he slowly balled them into tight, white-knuckled fists. He raised his head, his eyes locking directly onto Diane. The look in his eyes was no longer the look of a defeated, terrified boy seeking comfort. It was the absolute unhinged look of a rabid animal that had just realized it was backed into a corner by its own treacherous master. Diane had not just manipulated him into committing a terrible crime. She had systematically destroyed his entire existence from the shadows. She had secretly acted as the ruthless offshore loan shark, purposely feeding his underground gambling addiction, driving him into millions of dollars of insurmountable debt, and then offering him a fake poisonous lifeline that required him to betray his own blood. She had engineered his complete moral and financial bankruptcy just to secure the final massive prize for herself. A low, guttural growl began to build deep in Jason's throat. It was a terrifying primal sound, entirely stripped of the polished corporate executive persona he had proudly worn for the past decade. Diane saw the sudden violent shift in his posture. For the first time since I had kicked the heavy mahogany door open, genuine, unfiltered fear flickered across her perfectly composed, aristocratic features. She took a quick, panicked step backward, her expensive designer heels scraping loudly against the wooden floor, her back pressing hard against the large glass window overlooking the quiet morning street. She opened her mouth perhaps to issue another sharp, commanding lie, perhaps to try and manipulate his weak mind one last time, but she never got the chance to speak a single word. Jason exploded upward from the floor with a sudden, violent burst of kinetic energy. He launched himself completely across the room, bypassing the heavy glass desk entirely, his arms outstretched like a predatory bird diving for a kill. He hit Diane with the full, devastating force of his body weight. The physical impact was brutally loud. Diane let out a sharp, breathless shriek as they both crashed heavily against the thick window pane, the reinforced glass shuddering violently under the sudden, massive weight. Jason's hands immediately found her throat. He clamped his long fingers around her neck, squeezing with every ounce of insane, betrayed rage coursing through his veins. "You ruined my life," he screamed, his voice tearing painfully at his vocal cords, spraying saliva across her pale, terrified face. "You took absolutely everything from me. I will kill you right here." Diane fought back with the desperate, thrashing panic of a drowning woman. She clawed frantically at his face, her perfectly manicured fingernails tearing deep, bloody scratches across his cheeks and forehead. She kicked her legs wildly, her expensive shoes completely losing their grip on the smooth hardwood floor as she tried desperately to break his iron grip. But Jason was entirely deaf to reason, blinded by a complete psychological and emotional collapse. He drove her backward, his thumbs pressing brutally into her windpipe. Her face rapidly shifted from a flush of panicked red to a terrifying, oxygen-starved purple. Her eyes bulged, locking directly onto mine, silently screaming for the merciful intervention she had so callously denied my helpless daughter. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still in the center of the devastated office, my hands resting calmly at my sides, watching the two monsters who had conspired to murder me actively tear each other apart. It was a cold, silent, and deeply satisfying spectacle. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual paternal instinct to save the son who had eagerly sold his soul for a seat at the head of the corporate table. I felt no marital obligation to protect the wife who had meticulously poisoned my water glass every morning while smiling affectionately into my eyes. I simply watched them drown in the toxic, violent ocean of their own creation. The poetic justice of the moment was profound. They had united to destroy me, but the foundation of their dark alliance was built entirely on pure greed and deception. The moment that fragile foundation cracked, they immediately turned their fangs on each other. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror my daughter had felt for the last 2 years. I wanted them to experience the absolute crushing helplessness of being completely trapped. But the brutal execution was not meant to happen today. Marcus, the former tactical commander, moved with a sudden blinding speed. He closed the distance across the office in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Jason by the back of his tailored suit jacket and his thick leather belt, physically lifting my grown son completely off his feet. With a grunt of raw physical exertion, Marcus violently hurled Jason backward. Jason flew through the air, crashing heavily onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. The thick pane of decorative glass shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged pieces under his crushing weight. Before Jason could even attempt to recover his breath or scramble out of the broken glass, the local county sheriff was directly on top of him. The sheriff planted a heavy black boot firmly between Jason's shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the ruined floor. "Stop resisting right now!" the sheriff roared, his voice booming with absolute legal authority. "Put your hands behind your back!" Jason continued to thrash wildly, screaming incoherent curses at Diane, completely lost in his own violent psychosis. The sheriff did not hesitate. He grabbed Jason's left arm violently, twisting it upward at a painful, unnatural angle, forcing a sharp cry of physical pain from my son. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, with a series of loud, definitive metallic clicks. The golden boy, the untouchable corporate heir, was successfully reduced to a bleeding, handcuffed criminal, weeping in a pile of shattered glass. Diane had slumped heavily against the window, violently gasping for air, holding her bruised throat with both hands. She was coughing terribly, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. 2 of Marcus's tactical operatives stepped forward, their faces completely devoid of any sympathy. They grabbed her by the arms, roughly pulling her away from the window and forcing her to stand upright. Diane tried to pull her arms away, her arrogant entitlement attempting to resurface even in the face of total defeat. "Get your hands off me," she rasped, her voice a broken, painful wheeze. "I am a doctor. You cannot treat me like this." One of the operatives simply spun her around aggressively, forcing her arms behind her back. "You have the right to remain completely silent," the operative stated coldly, slapping a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. "I strongly suggest you start using it immediately." I stood in the center of the devastated office, breathing in the cold, stagnant air. The room was a complete disaster zone. Shattered glass covered the Persian rug. The heavy mahogany door hung uselessly from its broken hinges. The illusion of Diane's pristine, untouchable medical sanctuary was entirely destroyed forever. I looked down at Jason, who was now sobbing weakly against the floor, his face pressed into the dust, completely broken. I looked over at Diane, who was glaring at me with a hatred so pure and toxic it could have melted solid steel. They were both securely shackled, completely stripped of their power, their wealth, and their freedom. They had tried to bury me alive. They had tried to steal my legacy and lock my innocent daughter away in the dark. But they had tragically underestimated the absolute resolve of a father who had nothing left to lose. I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace wash over my tired soul. The war was officially over, and the enemy was entirely vanquished. Now it was time to turn my attention to the only thing that truly mattered. I watched without a single ounce of mercy as the tactical operatives hauled Diane and Jason out of the ruined office. Jason was completely limp, dragging his feet across the floor like a broken marionette whose strings had finally been cut. He did not look back at me. The crushing reality of his impending federal prison sentence had completely hollowed him out. Diane, on the other hand, fought until the very last possible second. As they dragged her through the splintered doorway, she twisted her head around her eyes, burning with a venomous, unrepentant fury. She spat a vile curse at me, her voice hoarse from the damage Jason had done to her throat, but the heavy oak doors of the lobby soon muffled her frantic screaming. I stepped carefully over the shattered glass of the coffee table and walked toward the massive window. Down on the quiet morning street, the flashing red and blue lights of the county sheriff cruisers painted the neighboring buildings in a harsh, rhythmic glow. I watched the officers aggressively force my treacherous wife and my deceitful son into the back of two separate squad cars. The heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed all the way up to the executive suite. The sirens wailed briefly, clearing the intersection, and then the vehicles sped away, disappearing completely into the sprawling concrete labyrinth of downtown Chicago. The suffocating, toxic, dark cloud that had hovered over my family for the last 2 years finally broke, entirely dissolving into the cool morning air. I turned my back to the window. The absolute silence in the office was deafening. Bradley Reed placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, gave me a single respectful nod, and quietly stepped out into the hallway to coordinate with Marcus and the remaining security personnel. I was finally completely alone with my daughter. I walked slowly toward the open threshold of the hidden medical vault. The heavy mahogany bookshelf was permanently jammed in the open position, exposing the sterile, terrifying prison where my flesh and blood had been held captive. I stepped inside the cold room. Mia was still sitting in the heavy motorized wheelchair, her head slumped forward, her thin shoulders trembling violently under her oversized sweater. The chaotic violence that had just erupted in the outer office had clearly terrified her further. She had squeezed her eyes tightly shut, completely, bracing herself for another round of psychological torture or physical abuse. I dropped slowly to my knees right in front of her, ignoring the sharp, protesting ache in my joints. I did not speak immediately. I simply reached out with incredibly slow, deliberate movements so I would not startle her. I gently placed my warm hands over her cold, bruised fingers. Mia gasped sharply, flinching backward against the leather seat, but I held on with a soft, steady pressure. "It is me, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice breaking under the massive weight of my overwhelming emotion. "It is your father. You are completely safe now. It is officially over. They are gone, and they are never ever coming back to hurt you again." Mia slowly opened her hollow, dark eyes. The heavy dosage of illegal sedatives still clouded her vision, making it difficult for her to focus. But as she looked down into my face, the absolute terror began to slowly melt away. Her cracked lips parted, and a single agonizing sob tore through her fragile chest. "Dad," she whimpered, her voice incredibly weak and raspy. "I thought you were dying. She told me you were dying." I shook my head, thick, hot tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and running freely down my weathered cheeks. "I am right here, Mia." I promised her, my vision blurring with a mixture of profound grief and absolute relief. "I am not going anywhere. I am going to live a very long time, and I am going to spend every single second of it making sure you are protected." I reached up toward the tall metal pole standing next to the wheelchair. The plastic intravenous bag was still slowly dripping its toxic sedative-laced fluid into the clear tubing. I grabbed the bag and violently ripped it off the metal hook, throwing it forcefully onto the floor, where it burst open, spilling the clear poison across the sterile white tiles. Then, with the utmost care, I peeled the harsh medical tape away from the bruised skin on the back of her pale hand. I gently slid the sharp steel needle out of her vein, pressing a clean piece of sterile gauze over the tiny puncture wound. I moved down to the heavy leather straps securing her thin wrists to the armrests of the chair. I unbuckled them one by one, tossing the thick restraints aside with extreme prejudice. When her hands were finally entirely free, Mia leaned forward with a desperate, heartbreaking urgency. She threw her fragile arms around my neck, burying her face deep into my shoulder. I wrapped my arms tightly around her trembling torso, pulling her out of the cold leather chair and holding her securely against my chest. We knelt together on the floor of that terrible room, surrounded by medical equipment and bad memories, weeping openly into each other's shoulders. The tears I cried were born from a deep, agonizing well of regret. I wept for the 2 years of her beautiful life that were cruelly stolen away. I wept because I had blindly trusted the monsters who had inflicted this unimaginable pain upon her. But mixed within that bitter regret was a powerful cleansing wave of absolute redemption. I had found her. I had fought through the lies, the poison, and the betrayal, and I had successfully pulled my little girl out of the darkness. I held her fiercely, rocking her back and forth, whispering a continuous stream of apologies and promises into her tangled hair. I am so incredibly sorry, but you are finally completely free. The journey back to the light was not an overnight process. Immediately after carrying Mia out of that dark, suffocating room, I transported her to a highly secure private rehabilitation center, completely outside of Diane's corrupted network. I stayed by her bedside day and night as a team of real compassionate doctors carefully flushed the heavy illegal sedatives from her fragile system. I watched the color slowly return to her pale cheeks. I watched the profound, haunting terror gradually fade from her dark eyes, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. At the exact same time, my own physical health miraculously rebounded. Without the daily dose of toxic powder burning through my veins, my heart rhythm stabilized. My blood pressure returned to a perfectly normal level. The suffocating fatigue completely evaporated. The frail, dying old man that my treacherous wife and greedy son had so desperately relied upon was officially buried, replaced by a father who was ready to watch the wheels of justice completely crush his enemies. The legal storm that followed our rescue was absolutely unprecedented. Bradley Reed, operating with the cold, methodical precision of a master tactician, handed a massive mountain of undeniable evidence directly to the federal prosecutors. We gave them the digital audio recordings of Diane and Jason plotting to murder me and steal the trust fund. We gave them the forensic accounting records tracing the embezzled corporate funds directly to Diane's offshore accounts. We gave them the physical gel capsules laced with poison and the terrifying medical vault hidden behind the mahogany bookshelf. It was not a difficult case to build. It was an absolute avalanche of irrefutable guilt. The criminal trial was a highly publicized spectacle, much to the absolute horror of my former wife. Diane tried to use her expensive, high-profile defense attorneys to spin a web of complex medical lies, but the jury saw right through her arrogant facade. I sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day, watching the woman who had shared my bed slowly unravel. On the day of her sentencing, she stood before the federal judge wearing a drab, oversized prison uniform that completely swallowed her aristocratic pride. The judge looked down at her with profound disgust, calling her actions a calculated, monstrous betrayal of both her medical oath and her marital vows. When he slammed his heavy wooden gavel down and sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, Diane finally broke. Her knees buckled, and she let out a piercing, desperate wail as the armed bailiffs grabbed her arms. She looked back at me one last time as they dragged her through the heavy courtroom doors, her face twisted in pure agony. I did not blink. I simply watched her disappear into the dark, miserable future she had meticulously dug for herself. She would spend the rest of her natural life in a concrete cell, completely stripped of her wealth, her status, and her freedom. Jason's fate was equally satisfying, though entirely pathetic. Facing decades behind bars, my son immediately tried to turn state's evidence against his stepmother, weeping openly on the witness stand as he detailed her massive underground gambling syndicate. He desperately begged the judge for leniency, claiming he was heavily manipulated and terrified for his life. But the justice system and his father offered absolutely no mercy. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for his active role in the kidnapping, extortion, and corporate embezzlement. But his prison sentence was only a fraction of his ultimate punishment. Before the criminal trial even concluded, Bradley and I finalized the absolute destruction of his financial future. I stood before a civil magistrate and completely severed my biological ties to my firstborn son. I legally stripped Jason of every single penny of his inheritance. I revoked his shares, completely erased his name from the family trust fund, and permanently banned him from ever holding a position within the holding company again. He had traded his soul for absolute power, and he walked away with absolutely nothing. With the monsters securely locked away in federal cages, I turned my attention to the massive real estate empire that had sparked this entire nightmare. I realized that the pursuit of endless wealth had created a toxic, cutthroat environment that nearly cost me my daughter's life. I no longer wanted the burden of the throne. With Bradley's expert legal guidance, I completely stepped down from any active role in the corporation. We handed the entire billion-dollar enterprise over to a highly vetted, incredibly strict board of professional directors. They were neutral, aggressive executives who answered only to a blind trust. The company would continue to generate massive wealth, but I would no longer let it define my existence. I cashed out a significant portion of my primary shares, completely securing Mia's financial future in an ironclad, unassailable account that no one could ever touch without her direct, conscious consent. The dark, stressful chapters of corporate warfare were finally closed forever. I was completely done fighting for money and power. I only wanted to focus my energy on the true meaning of family. I wanted to fight for the remaining time I had left with the people who actually loved me, leaving the shadows of greed far behind us in the cold dust. Instead of returning to the sprawling mansion Diane had curated as my velvet prison, I ordered my team to sell the estate. I refused to spend another night breathing the same air my deceitful wife and traitorous son had breathed. The proceeds from the massive sale were transferred into a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of illegal medical confinement. It felt fitting to use the wealth Diane coveted to destroy the very type of manipulative prisons she had built for my daughter. We were entirely erasing the dark, toxic footprints those two monsters left on our family legacy, purifying the deeply poisoned ground. We left Chicago behind us before the first snow of winter could fall upon the city streets. I did not want Mia to spend another holiday season anywhere near the towering skyscrapers and cold concrete that had served as the backdrop for her unimaginable suffering. Instead, we traveled west, leaving the noise and the bitter memories far behind us. I purchased a sprawling, isolated ranch nestled deep in the rugged mountains of Montana. It was a place defined by endless stretches of vibrant green pine trees, crystal-clear rivers, and a sky so vast and open it made you feel as though you could finally breathe again. The ranch was surrounded by miles of heavy timber fencing and monitored by a discreet but highly effective security team managed by Marcus, ensuring that no unwanted shadows could ever creep up on us again. When we first arrived at the ranch, Mia was still incredibly fragile. The transition from a windowless, sterile medical vault to the boundless expanse of the Montana wilderness was overwhelming for her. For the first few weeks, she rarely left the wrap-around wooden porch. She would sit wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring out at the snow-capped peaks, her eyes wide and searching. I did not push her. Healing from the kind of deep systemic trauma she endured cannot be rushed. It requires patience, silence, and an abundance of unconditional love. I spent my days reading quietly beside her, or chopping firewood, letting the simple rhythmic tasks of rural life slowly replace the cutthroat anxiety of my former corporate existence. As the harsh winter melted into a vibrant, blooming spring, I began to witness a beautiful, miraculous transformation. The fresh mountain air and the absolute safety of our new environment slowly breathed life back into my daughter. She began taking short walks down to the riverbed, skipping stones across the surface of the rushing water. We adopted a pair of gentle rescue horses, and I watched with tears in my eyes as Mia brushed their coats, whispering softly to them. The profound connection with the animals seemed to unlock a door inside her heart that Diane and Jason had bolted shut. One afternoon, as we were riding along a sunlit trail, Mia suddenly urged her horse into a full gallop. I watched her ride ahead of me, her hair catching the golden afternoon light, and for the first time in over 2 years, I heard the clear, ringing sound of her genuine laughter echoing through the canyon. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Sitting on the porch in the quiet evenings watching the sun sink below the jagged mountain horizon, I often reflect on the massive sweeping destruction that brought us here. I spent 40 arduous years of my life building a financial empire. I sacrificed my time, my health, and my peace of mind to accumulate wealth, mistakenly believing that money was the ultimate shield capable of protecting my family from the cruelties of the world. I was completely wrong. Money was not a shield. It was a bright, blinding beacon that attracted the most dangerous predators on earth. It invited a monster into my bed and transformed my own flesh and blood into a ruthless, calculating traitor. The pursuit of endless wealth is a terrible, consuming disease. It rots the human soul from the inside out, blinding people to the inherent value of human life and replacing compassion with a cold, insatiable hunger for more. Jason and Diane had access to every luxury the modern world could possibly offer. They wore tailored clothes, drove expensive cars, and lived in sprawling mansions, but they were entirely impoverished in spirit. They were so consumed by their desperate greed that they willingly threw away the only thing that actually matters in this brief, fragile existence. They threw away family. I learned the hardest, most painful lesson a father can ever learn. Family is not simply determined by shared DNA or a legal marriage certificate. Blood is not a guarantee of loyalty, and a ring is not a guarantee of love. True family is forged in the fires of mutual respect, unwavering protection, and unconditional sacrifice. Bradley Reed, a corporate lawyer I hired decades ago, proved to be more of a brother to me than anyone else. And Marcus, a security contractor I paid to do a job, showed more integrity and honor in a single morning than my own son showed in a decade. We cannot choose the people who are brought into our lives by birth or by circumstance, but we possess the absolute power to choose who we keep beside us. I chose to cut away the rotting branches of my family tree so that the trunk could survive. It was a brutal amputation, but it was necessary. Today, my heart no longer aches for the son I lost to the allure of greed. I mourn the boy he used to be, but I feel no sorrow for the criminal he chose to become. My heart is full, focused entirely on the beautiful, resilient young woman sitting beside me on the porch, sipping hot tea and watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. Mia is currently studying landscape architecture online, designing massive open gardens that thrive in the natural sunlight. She refuses to draw anything with 4 solid walls. She is reclaiming her future step by brave step. And I am simply a grateful old man, blessed with a second chance to be the father she truly deserves. We survived the absolute worst of human nature, and we emerged into the light with our dignity and our souls entirely intact. Did you like my story? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.